Hare Krishna. So read a little bit from the adventures, pastimes, and activities of the extraordinary A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna. But I was just considering how Prabhupada never got big. He never got big. He was always small. But big things were happening all around him by his influence. But he himself always remained small. Which is the actual situation for the living entities is very small. It's a teeny tiny little particle of Krishna. So he had so much potency, but he never got like big. And he was always free to move. Free in the sense that he wasn't entangled by situations, that he was always engaged in serving Krishna, and he had freedom to go here and there and move everywhere. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna. Like a beautiful, rare gem. It's very small, can be, but very powerful, very beautiful. Hare Krishna, Krishna. Big lump of iron, big and heavy, but hey, you've got this gorgeous gem. It is like Prabhupada. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna. Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna. Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna. Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare. I mean, we can see how, there's computers now, very, very powerful, can do all kinds of things. And the chip that runs it is like teeny tiny. Like, in the 1980s, I was one of the first ones to get a desktop computer. And that thing was huge. And it wasn't all that great by today's standards. It definitely wasn't user-friendly. But now you can see there's a little teeny tiny chip. There can be so much information. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna. So Prabhupada was small, but very powerful. So many things were happening and are happening because of his influence. Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna. Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna. The power of pure and uncontaminated. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna. Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna. Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare. Sometimes someone would make an offering to Prabhupada, give a valuable gift, like a very expensive watch. And from what I understand is Prabhupada would wear the watch for a little while and then give it away. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna. Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna. Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna. Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna. Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna. Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Okay, so let's read about Prabhupada from the biography, so nicely written by Satsvarupa Goswami, who traveled with Prabhupada early on, was his secretary and his cook, and then did very valuable service throughout the movement, management positions, editorial. He edited the Back to Godhead magazine, transcribed the translations as Prabhupada was composing the Bhagavatam, transcribing from the tapes. A lot of wonderful service, Satsvarupa. So here, Prabhupada it's the title, there's 6 volumes of Prabhupada's pastimes and activities. And this is before he comes to India, New Delhi. He's lost his business, his spiritual masters organization, nobody can work together, it's all fractioned off. And he's tried to work with them, but he can't. His ideas are too progressive. They don't want to go so fast. And so here he is on his own. And he has no money, nowhere to live. He's going from house to house. And as long as he can engage in trying to serve what Bhaktivedanta asked him to do, print books in English, preach in English, then he says amazingly he feels quite satisfied. He has no income, no place to live, but he's writing in English and translating. So in February of 1956, while the U.S. was struggling with civil rights, Khrushchev and Eisenhower were both openly deploring the arms race and were maneuvering in nuclear disarmament talks, and the Shah of Iran was visiting New Delhi. Abai was trying to print Back to Godhead. In winter's discomfort, he walked through the early morning streets of Delhi to visit Surendra Kumar Jain, the printer, to read the latest proofs. By walking, he saved money. Only when he was delivering paper from the paper dealer to the printer would he rent a rickshaw. He had no chadar, to keep you warm, only a lightweight cotton jacket, and he wore rubber shoes. He also wore a cotton hat that covered his ears and tied beneath his chin, protecting him from the 40-degree wintry mornings, and sometimes gusty winds. 40 degrees is cold. Kumar Jain, this is the printer, and he gives quite a long comment here. So the printer says, "My first impression was he was a nice person and straightforward. I felt pity also because of the conditions under which he would come. I know he didn't have even 25 pice. That's like way less than a penny. He would come all the way on foot and without any breakfast or anything. He would come in the morning to the press, and when I would ask him, 'Swamiji, did you have anything to eat this morning?' he would say, 'Oh no, Mr. Jain, I just came because I had to see the proofs.' 'That's all right,' I would say. 'I will get breakfast for you.' I would call for breakfast, and we would sit and work. He would do the proofreading himself. The printing was done by me. Most of the time he would like to be present when that final printing was being done. He would come in the morning around 7 and stay until he had seen all the proofs. It was a regular thing that he would come without breakfast. I would arrange for breakfast, and we would sit across the table from one another for hours together. He was always talking on religious subjects only. But when we would be sitting, especially when waiting for the proofs to come, we would discuss many things. I felt he knew quite a lot, because he was a well-read person. He was more a friend than just a person coming to get things printed. He was a very simple man, straightforward in his habits, but his mission at that time was particularly to further the movement of back to Godhead. His financial condition was very, very weak. Sometimes the printing would be difficult because he would not be able to arrange for the paper. Many times I told him that if he was feeling difficulty, why was he continuing? But he said, "No, it is my mission, and I will always carry it on as far as possible." I tried to accommodate him to the maximum possible extent, but he was a real pauper. I only did the printing, and he had to arrange for the paper, so sometimes it was delayed. Although my job was printing, sometimes I would say, "All right, you are so keen, I will give you the paper." But usually he would arrange for it himself, since we only did printing. He would bring it in a rickshaw. We were not uncomfortable together, but as business would have it, if the bills were standing for a long time, then I would ask him if he could do something about it, and he would say, "Don't worry, you can be sure that your money is coming." I never asked him where his funds were coming from, because I felt that was his personal matter, but it was embarrassing for him when he could not pay. So I never tried to embarrass him. He was concerned that he didn't have money, that if he didn't have money, how could he print the paper? And he definitely wanted to run that paper. He wanted to preach the teachings of the Gita. He thought of it as a sort of movement, that it was the only way that people in the world could find peace. His conviction was very strong. After picking up the copies from the printer, Abai would walk around the city selling them. He would take a seat at a tea stand, and when someone sat beside him, Abai would ask him to please take a copy of Back to Godhead. He also went to the homes and offices of people who had already donated or agreed to see him, and he sought out new contacts, sometimes on recommendation or sometimes by going uninvited, wherever he could find a potential reader. When he delivered copies to regular donors, he would discuss the previous issue's philosophy with them, sometimes write articles on topics they requested. So this is a quote. "Our esteemed friend, Sri Vishan Prasad Maheshwari, one of the learned advocates of the Supreme Court, has requested us to write something on the principle of fruitive action with special reference to vice and its potency." End quote. Often donors agreed to see him not so much out of a genuine interest or affection as out of a sense of obligation. In their traditional Hindu piety, they felt obliged to see the sadhu, take his paper, and even think well of him, but not necessarily to read his newspaper. Once, when Abai was approaching a well-to-do house, the owner came onto the second-floor veranda and shouted, "Go away, we don't want you here." Krishna. Abai, responding to the resistance, polite and impolite, that he met while selling Back to Godhead, wrote an article. So this is the title of the article. "No Time, a Chronic Disease of the Common Man," for the March 16th, 1956 issue. And here's an excerpt. "When we approach some gentleman and request him to become a reader of Back to Godhead, sometimes we are replied with the words, 'No time.' They say they are too busy in earning money for maintaining the body and soul together. But when we ask them what do they mean for the soul, they have nothing to reply. Dr. Megnath Saha, a great scientist, was busily going to a meeting of the Planning Commission. Unfortunately, while going in his car on the road, he died and could not ask death to wait because he had no time at that moment. Dr. Ansari, the great Congress leader, while dying in a moving train on his way to home, said that he was himself a medical man and almost all his family were so. But death is so cruel that he was dying without any medical treatment. Therefore, death has been described in the Bhagavad as the indefatigable. Death is awaiting everyone, although everybody thinks he may not die. There is life after death. The busy man should try to know this also as to whether he is going. This life is but a spot in his longest journey, and a sane person should not be busy with a spot only. Nobody says that the body should not be maintained, but everybody should know from Bhagavad Gita that the body is the outward dress, and the soul is the real person who puts on the dress. So if the dress is taken care of only, without any care of the real person, it's sheer foolishness and a waste of time. So that was from the article, Back to Godhead. Abai was an unusual newspaper vendor. He didn't loudly hawk his paper on the street or sell it from a newsstand. He approached individuals quietly as they sat to drink tea, or he would call on acquaintances in their offices or places of business. Taking a copy from the stack he carried underneath his arm, he would present what appeared to be an ordinary tabloid newspaper with bold black headlines across the front page. But what odd headlines! The lowest of mankind, philosophical problems with social awareness, sufferings of humanity, the pure consciousness of nationalism. Anyone could tell at a glance that this was no ordinary newspaper. Abai would say something to try to convince them to take it before they said, "No time." On behalf of his spiritual master and the previous Vaishnava Acharyas, he was playing a role. The newspaper salesman, a smiling demeanor, a gentlemanly invitation. No, it wasn't an ordinary newspaper, but they would find it interesting. And it cost only 6 pice. Thus he was extending the mercy of Lord Chaitanya, handing out the truths of the Vedas in the easy-to-take form of a newspaper. Despite his desperate poverty and the urgency of his message, his writing was never shrill, strident, or fanatical. He wrote expecting to find his reader prepared to hear sound philosophy and always willing to accept the truth, especially when they presented logically and relevantly and supported by the authoritative Vedic literature. Although experience on the streets of Delhi had shown him that people were shallow, distracted, and uninterested in self-realization, he knew that most people, at least sometime in their lives, pondered the crucial themes of philosophy: whether God exists, whether he's a person, why is there suffering. So Abai appealed to their higher sentiments. Spring of 1956 brought visits from the U.S. Secretary of State Dulles. And in a few days, Lord Mountbatten, the former Governor General of India, who was greeted at the airport by thousands. Then came the celebration of the once sacred day of Holi, when urchins spray all passerbys with colored dyes. Prime Minister Nehru toured the Delhi slums, expressing disgust at the prevailing conditions. He announced India's intention to develop atomic energy, stressing its peaceful uses. The weather warmed, a border clash began between India and Pakistan. Delhi Railroad workers went on strike. Meanwhile, Abai continued to preach. he somehow managed to meet the financial, editorial, and printing demands and published his 6th issue for the year of 1956, the May 20th edition of Back to Godhead. The front page carried a special notice. Title: As a Matter of Principle. Please read Back to Godhead and revive your deeper aspect of personality. There is nothing in it which our ideology manufactured by imperfect sense perception, but all that it contains are messages of our liberated sages. We're simply helping them to speak again to men and women in easy language for real life. Every responsible man and woman must therefore read it regularly at a cost of very insignificant sum, 2 to 4 rupees a year, or 3 pice a month. Is that annas? Maybe 3 annas per month. Do not neglect it. It is for your interest. It will create a happy society of humanity. In title, How to Broadcast the Teachings of Bhagavad Gita, he talked about the need for spiritual organization in society, a model community which he named Gita Nagari, the village where the Bhagavad Gita is sung. He would live by the Bhagavad Gita and preach its message to the world. Praising Mahatma Gandhi for his Vaishnava qualities, Abai suggested that Gandhi had also esteemed the Gita Nagari concept. It was the only way of relief from the sufferings caused by demoniac principled leaders who were misguiding the present demoralized civilization. He was calculating how to capture the restless popular imagination. He wanted to present Krishna's teachings in a clear, straightforward way and distribute them widely. He felt that good arguments from authoritative scripture would appeal to sane, impartial, educated people, even though they claimed to be uninterested. He knew that somehow, without abandoning his gravity and his absolute conclusion, he must capture their interest. They were relegating religion to some book of scriptures on the shelf that they never read and didn't understand or couldn't believe. He brought it to them as a newspaper, yet it was as good as the scriptures. No, it wasn't what they expected in a newspaper, but they might read it. Here's a little excerpt. The chanting process of the holy name of God, as conducted by the propaganda of Back to Godhead, is not pleasing to the superficial pleasure hunters describing men and women in indecent literatures in national news, but it is the means of relishing transcendental eternal life. In addition to selling Back to Godhead at tea stalls and delivering copies to donors, Abai also mailed out free copies, both within India and abroad. For years, the vast audience of English-speaking readers outside India had concerned him, and he wanted to reach them. Having gathered addresses of libraries, universities, cultural and government outlets outside India, he mailed as many Back to Godheads as he could afford. He prepared a letter for his Western readers suggesting that they should be even more receptive than his countrymen. So this is from the letter. Although the messages contained in Back to Godhead are all gifts of ancient sages of India who actually realized the absolute truth, yet at the present moment the so-called leaders of India are too much enamored by Western way of material advancement of knowledge. They are completely neglecting the treasure house of knowledge left by the sages. You gentlemen of the Western countries have seen much about material science, and yet peace is not within your control. In most cases you may be feeling the want of peace, although you have enough materially. This basic defect of materialism remains undetected by the misleaders of India, and therefore they're not serious about going back to Godhead, the ultimate aim of life's journey. On the home front, Abai sent copies of his latest issue of Back to Godhead to the President of India, Dr. Rajendra Prasad, along with a letter warning of perilous fate that awaits a society conducted by asuras. Underlined, please therefore save them from the great fall down. Abai's letter of November 21st, 1956 was outspoken. Here's an excerpt. I have got the clue of going back to Godhead just after leaving my present material body, and in order to take along with me all my contemporary men and women of the world, I have started my newspaper, Back to Godhead, as one of the means to the way. Please don't think of me as something wonderful or a madman when I say that I shall go back to Godhead after leaving my present material body. It is quite possible for everyone and all of us. Abai requested His Excellency at least to glance over the headlines of the enclosed 12 copies of Back to Godhead and considered granting the editor an interview. There was immense work to be done on behalf of India's spiritual heritage, and there should be a specific ministry of spiritual affairs for this purpose. Quote, I am crying alone in the wilderness at the present moment, wrote Abai. But His Excellency never replied. In his Back to Godhead, Abai was making propaganda against atheistic view. In an article titled Hope Against Hope, he frankly admitted that 80% of the people he met while selling Back to Godhead were atheists. So here's an excerpt from that. Little allergy tea. So this is from Hope Against Hope. Sometimes we meet gentlemen of up-to-date taste and try to make them interested in the matter of Back to Godhead. They say frankly that they have not only no interest in such theistic subject, but they also condemn the attempt to bring people in general, back to the path of Godhead. According to these gentlemen, economic conditions of the Indian people deteriorated on account of too much faith in God. And the sooner they forget everything about God, it is better for them. But we cannot agree with this atheistic conclusion of such up-to-date gentlemen devoid of the sense of Godhead. Abai argued that although independent India was now educating her citizens in godless materialism, her economic conditions were not improving. Many Indians did not even have the bare necessities of life. He cited that 120,000 were unemployed in Delhi. And here's a quote. Some of the well-posted government servants or some of the fortunate businessmen may feel themselves happy, but 90% of their brother citizens do not know how to meet both ends together, and therefore the economic condition is definitely not satisfactory. He quoted former United States President Harry S. Truman as saying that national independence means that the citizens should have a comfortable life. So if that were the case, said Abai, where was India's independence? His point was that all attempts at happiness and prosperity are unlawful as long as they fail to recognize the proprietorship of the Supreme Lord. An atheistic civilization could never produce peace. And another article entitled Progressive Ambition and Unsatiated Lust, the excerpt is, there is no dearth of money, but there is dearth of peace in the world. The whole human energy having been diverted to this money-making business, it has certainly increased the cheap money-making capacity of the total population, but the result is that such unrestricted and unlawful inflation of money has created a bad economy and has enabled us to manufacture huge, costly weapons for destroying the result of such cheap money-making business. The authorities of big money-making countries, instead of enjoying peace, are now engaged in making important plans how they can save themselves from the modern destructive weapons. And as a matter of fact, a huge sum of money is being thrown into the sea for making an experiment on such dreadful weapons. Such experiments are being carried out not only at huge cost, but also at cost of many poor lives, binding thereby such nations in the laws of karma. So this whole section here, when he was in Delhi and he was struggling to print the Back to Godhead, and his articles were very pointed and timely. Krishna. Jai Srila Prabhupada. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama. You can see he never had any doubt. Like, why did I give up my family? Oh, I should have stayed with my business. I should have. No, at least it's not described here that he ever. No, he's engaged in serving according to the instructions of his spiritual master. And he's accepting the results are up to Krishna, but he's rightly situated in service. The mission of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Hare Krishna. So we all know what happened, more or less. The Hare Krishna explosion! Worldwide, every town and village. Hare Krishna. Krishna.